The most surprising and emotional moment comes when Ethan and Jacob, standing side by Richard's grave, realize that Shadow, the horse, who had silently carried their father's secrets, had been the key to healing their fractured relationship. As Shadow walks away from the grave, the weight of the past lifts, and the brothers finally begin their new life together. It marks the moment they truly become a family. The sun began its descent behind the distant hills, casting a soft, golden hue over the sprawling fields of Ethan's father's ranch. The air was thick with the earthy scent of hay and fresh soil, a quiet reminder of the life that had once thrived here. Ethan stood at the weathered gates of the ranch, his worn hands gripping the rusted iron, his heart heavy with sorrow. His dark eyes, usually sharp and focused, were now clouded with the weight of loss. The ranch, once a symbol of family pride and unity, felt eerily silent without the firm presence of Richard, his father, who had passed away unexpectedly only a few months earlier. Ethan's life had always been intertwined with horses. From a young age, his father had introduced him to the art of horse training, guiding him through the complexities of riding and caring for these magnificent creatures. Yet, despite their shared love for horses, their relationship had always been strained. Richard had been a man of few words, and his affection was often hidden behind a tough, unyielding exterior. But when it came to horses, the two of them had understood each other like no one else. It had been the one thing that truly connected them, even as the years stretched between them and the weight of unspoken words hung in the air. Now, standing before the ranch, Ethan felt a profound disconnect. The farm, the horses, even the wind seemed to echo with the absence of his father. Everything around him felt both familiar and foreign, as if the place had once belonged to someone else. His father's old truck sat, abandoned in the driveway, its tires worn and covered in dust. The barn, which had been filled with the sounds of hooves and laughter just months ago, now stood still, its wooden walls creaking softly in the wind. The emptiness was suffocating, as if the very land mourned with him. But then, as if drawn by some invisible force, his gaze was pulled toward the farthest corner of the ranch. There, standing at the edge of the pasture, was a horse, magnificent and regal, its glossy black coat shining in the dying light. It was Shadow, the horse his father had once prized above all others. Richard had always believed that Shadow had a spirit unlike any other. He had been the one to train the horse, shaping him into a creature of unparalleled grace and strength. Shadow had been the pride of the ranch, and for Richard, he had been more than just a horse. He had been a companion, a symbol of his life's work, and perhaps the closest thing to a friend he had ever known. But since Richard's death, Shadow had been different. The once proud and steady horse now wandered aimlessly, as though lost. He would no longer stand proudly in the paddock waiting for his daily training or the soothing rhythm of his master's commands. Instead, he roamed the vast expanse of the ranch, his steps slow and deliberate, as if searching for something he could no longer find. It was as if the very spirit of the horse had been shattered with the loss of his owner. Ethan felt a pang in his chest as he observed the horse from a distance. The bond between his father and Shadow had been undeniable, and now, in the wake of his father's death, that connection seemed to haunt the animal. Ethan's steps were slow as he made his way toward the pasture. His heart ached as he thought about his father, the man who had shaped him into the person he was, yet had never truly been there in the way Ethan had longed for. He wasn't sure if it was his own grief or the palpable sorrow of Shadow that kept him from turning away. As he approached the horse, Shadow raised his head and met Ethan's gaze. There was something in those deep, dark eyes, an unspoken understanding, a sense of recognition. But there was also a profound sadness, as though the horse, too, was lost without his master. Ethan stopped a few feet away from the horse, his heart racing. He could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the past pressing down on him. He had always been the one to care for the horses, too. Train them, to help them reach their full potential. But this was different. This was not just any horse. This was Shadow, the horse his father had once loved like no other. The two of them stood there, staring at each other in silence. The wind rustled the tall grasses around them, the only sound breaking the stillness. Ethan could feel the grief swirling around. And like a storm, he had come here hoping for some sense of closure, some way to make peace with the loss of his father. But now, standing before Shadow, he realized that this journey would not be as simple as he had hoped. As the sun continued its descent, casting long shadows over the land, Ethan made his way to the old barn. His mind was clouded with thoughts of his father, of the way their relationship had been defined by the horses they had trained together. And yet, despite all the tension between them, Ethan couldn't help but feel that his father had left him something in Shadow. Perhaps it wasn't just the horse's skill or strength that Richard had wanted Ethan to inherit, but something deeper, a bond that could transcend the walls that had kept them apart for so long. Later that evening, as the sky turned dark and the first stars began to appear, Ethan found himself standing at the edge of the small graveyard that sat just beyond the ranch's pasture. He had come here to visit his father's grave, to finally say goodbye. The weight of the day, the overwhelming sense of loss, seemed to press in on him from all sides. He had always been close to his father in his own way, but now, in the wake of his passing, Ethan was unsure of where he fit in this world. What was left for him now that the man who had shaped him was gone? As he approached the grave, his steps faltered. There, standing motionless by the headstone, was Shadow. The horse had not moved for hours, and there was an unsettling stillness to the scene. Shadow's head was lowered, his dark eyes fixed on the grave as though he were mourning. Ethan could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. It was as though the horse had been waiting for him, waiting for something that he couldn't quite understand. He stood there, staring at the two of them, the grave and the horse, wondering what it all meant. What had brought Shadow here? Why had he refused to leave? The horse's distress was palpable, and Ethan knew that there was something more at play here than mere grief. Shadow had always been more than just an animal. He had been a companion, a friend, and now, in his deep sadness, he seemed to be seeking something, perhaps even closure. Ethan's heart swelled with a mixture of confusion and compassion. He stepped forward slowly, his voice barely a whisper. "It's okay, boy," he murmured as he reached out a hand toward the horse. "We'll figure this out together." As his hand rested gently on Shadow's shoulder, Ethan felt a deep connection with the animal, a bond that transcended words. For a moment, it seemed as if time stood still, and the pain of the past few months, the weight of his father's death, and the uncertainty of the future all faded into the background. In that instant, it was just him and Shadow, two souls connected by something larger than themselves. For the first time since his father's death, Ethan felt a sense of peace wash over him. He wasn't sure where this bond would take him or what it would mean for his future, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't alone. And perhaps, just perhaps, Shadow wasn't either. The following days blurred into a haze of confusion and frustration. Ethan found himself caught between his duties as a horse trainer and the growing mystery of Shadow's behavior. The once proud horse, usually so full of life and energy, now seemed like a ghost, lost, restless, and consumed by an unyielding obsession. No matter what Ethan tried, Shadow refused to leave the grave. He wouldn't eat, drink, or even acknowledge Ethan's presence when he approached. It was as if the horse had become fixated on that spot, as if something or someone was holding him there. Ethan had tried everything to get Shadow to return to the stable. He would lead the horse by the reins, gently coaxing him with soft words, but Shadow would resist, digging his hooves into the ground, determined not to budge. It was a behavior Ethan had never seen in the horse before. one that was both deeply unsettling and impossible to explain. The horse's refusal to leave the grave, even in the face of hunger and thirst, was a sign that something was wrong, something beyond mere grief. As the days wore on, Ethan found himself staring at the horse for hours, wondering what was keeping him there. It was as if Shadow was waiting for something, something that only the horse knew, something tied to the past, to Richard, and to the deep connection they had shared. It wasn't just grief or loss that bound Shadow to the grave. It was something far more mysterious, something that Ethan couldn't yet understand. The mystery of Shadow's obsession haunted Ethan in his waking hours and followed him into his dreams. And so, one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, Ethan sat in his father's old rocking chair, staring out over the ranch. He could feel the weight of his father's absence pressing on him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he was missing. It was as if the ranch itself held a secret, something hidden in the very soil beneath his feet. And Shadow, the horse who had always been so in tune with Richard, seemed to know that secret. The memories of his childhood began to flood Ethan's mind, unbidden and powerful. He remembered the long days spent working alongside his father in the barn, the quiet moments when Richard would take him aside and teach him about the horses. There was always something different about those lessons, something that went beyond training. Ethan had always admired his father's calm demeanor and his ability to read the horses, but there was one horse that seemed to have an almost mystical connection with Richard, Shadow. As a boy, Ethan had heard the stories. His father rarely spoke of his emotions, but Shadow had been the one thing that could bring out a rare tenderness in him. There were countless afternoons when Richard would spend hours with the horse, his hands gentle on Shadow's coat, as he whispered words that Ethan could never quite hear. Sometimes the two of them would stand in silence for what felt like an eternity, connected in a way that Ethan couldn't understand at the time. But looking back now, he realized that there was more to that bond than just a simple connection between man and animal. There was something deeper, something that Ethan couldn't quite grasp, but could feel pulsing beneath the surface. He remembered the way Richard would smile, just a faint curve of his lips, when Shadow did something unexpected, something only the horse seemed capable of. There were moments when it felt as though Richard and Shadow were communicating without words, their bond so deep that it transcended the usual boundaries between human and animal. It was as though Shadow could understand Richard's thoughts, his desires, even his fears. And there were rumors whispered among the locals that Richard would sometimes confide in the horse as if he were speaking to a trusted friend. Ethan had never understood those stories, had never truly believed that a horse could hold such power over a man. But now, as he stood before Shadow, he couldn't help but wonder if the bond between his father and the horse had been more than just a simple partnership. Had it been something supernatural? Something that transcended the boundaries of life and death? The townspeople's tales only added to the growing sense of mystery. Ethan had gone into town a few times, hoping to find some answers from the people who had known his father better than he did. The old ranchers and locals spoke of Richard with a mixture of respect and reverence. But it wasn't long before the subject of Shadow came up. There was always something special about that horse, one of the older ranchers, Tom, had said one afternoon while sipping his coffee at the local diner. Your father never told anyone, but we all knew. Shadow could sense things that no one else could. Richard always trusted him more than he trusted anyone else, I'd say. Ethan listened intently, his heart racing. What do you mean? What did he trust him with? Tom leaned in, lowering his voice as though sharing a secret. There were times late at night when we'd see Richard out by the barn, whispering to Shadow. He talked to him like the horse could understand every word. It wasn't just about the horses, you know? Sometimes it was like Richard was confiding in him, things that he'd never say to anyone else. Ethan frowned. He had heard rumors, of course, whispers of strange occurrences around the ranch, tales of Shadow's uncanny ability to sense Richard's moods, to be in tune with his unspoken thoughts. But hearing it from Tom made it all feel more real, more unsettling. Could it be that Richard had been hiding something? And now, was Shadow trying to communicate that secret? Or was he guarding something his master had left behind? The more Ethan thought about it, the more he began to suspect that Shadow wasn't just grieving. No, this was different. There was something deeper at play here, something tied to his father's past. The horse's attachment to the grave wasn't just out of sorrow. It was as though he was guarding something Ethan couldn't see. One evening, after another fruitless attempt to lead Shadow away from the grave, Ethan sat down on the ground beside the horse. He reached out a hand and rested it gently on Shadow's back, his fingers trembling slightly. The air was thick with tension, the silence between them almost oppressive. Ethan could feel the weight of the horse's sadness, but he also felt something else, an undeniable pull, as if Shadow was trying to tell him something. "I don't know what it is you're trying to show me, boy," Ethan whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "But I'll find out. I swear it." Shadow's head turned slowly, his dark eyes meeting Ethan's. And for a fleeting moment, Ethan could have sworn the horse understood every word. The air around them seemed to shift, the temperature dropping ever so slightly, as though the very land was holding its breath. There was a secret here, and Shadow, it seemed, was the only one who knew it. Ethan's frustration grew each day. The relentless search for answers, for a clue, for anything that could explain Shadow's strange obsession with his father's grave, was beginning to wear on him. Each morning, he woke with a sense of urgency, a gnawing feeling that he was on the verge of discovering something monumental. But each night, he went to bed feeling more lost than before. He had combed through the house, searching his father's old study, the barn, even the attic, but nothing had revealed itself. Every drawer he opened, every box he turned over, only seemed to add to the mystery and increase the unease gnawing at his chest. Ethan knew there was something important, something hidden, but no matter how hard he tried, the pieces refused to fit together. The ranch was eerily quiet as Ethan walked through the fields, Shadow once again standing by his father's grave, staring at the gravestone with an intensity that felt almost too deliberate. Ethan had tried everything, leading the horse back to the stable, calling him, trying to coax him with food, but Shadow simply wouldn't leave. There were times when Ethan felt the weight of the past pressing on him, like he was being drawn into a mystery too large, too consuming for him to unravel on his own. It felt as though the ranch itself was holding a secret, one that only Shadow could reveal, but the horse was keeping it to himself, as if guarding it with a ferocity that bordered on the supernatural. One evening, as the sun set in a haze of orange and purple, Ethan sat on the ground by the grave, his head in his hands. The frustration had reached its peak. He was tired, exhausted, from days of fruitless searching, and yet there was no escaping the feeling that something was just beyond his grasp. The night air was thick with silence, and as he sat there, his mind wandering in a haze of confusion, he heard a rustling sound. Looking up, he saw Shadow acting agitated, his body tense and his hooves pawing at the earth, digging into the soft soil in a frantic manner. The horse snorted and pawed again, and for the first time, Ethan felt a deep sense of urgency. Shadow was no longer just standing there in mournful silence. He was trying to communicate, trying to draw attention to something beneath the surface. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he rose to his feet, moving cautiously toward the spot where Shadow's hooves were stirring the dirt. There was something strange about the way the horse was acting, more intense, more insistent. As he reached the spot, his eyes scanned the ground, and his gaze fell on something unexpected, a small, weathered envelope half buried in the dirt. It was sealed with a wax stamp, and the edges of the envelope were frayed with age, as though it had been buried for years. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He bent down slowly, his fingers trembling as he reached for the envelope, a sense of disbelief creeping over him. Could this be the clue he had been waiting for? With a careful hand, he brushed the dirt away and lifted the envelope from its resting place. The wax seal was unmistakable. It was the same seal his father had used on his personal letters. Ethan could feel the weight of the moment, the significance of what he had just uncovered. He turned the envelope over in his hands, his heart racing. The address was familiar, Richard. But it wasn't addressed to Ethan. It was addressed to his father alone. Who could have sent this? And why was it buried here, at the grave of someone who had passed away so recently? Ethan's fingers worked quickly to break the seal, the wax cracking with a satisfying pop. He slid the letter out carefully, unfolding it with a sense of reverence. The paper was thick and worn, yellowing at the edges, and the ink, though faded, was still legible. Ethan took a deep breath, his chest tightening as he read the contents of the letter. The handwriting was elegant, the words flowing with a sense of nostalgia and longing. The letter was from someone named Clara, someone Ethan had never heard of before. The name seemed foreign to him, yet there was something hauntingly familiar about it. His father had never mentioned Clara, at least not in any way that Ethan could recall. As he read on, a chill ran down his spine. The letter began with a heartfelt apology. Clara expressed her regret for leaving Richard all those years ago, but it was clear that there was more to the story than just a simple goodbye. Clara spoke of a love that had once burned brightly between her and Richard, a love that had been torn apart by circumstances beyond their control. She explained that Richard had never known the truth, that when she had left, she had been pregnant with his child, a child who, according to Clara, was now an adult and living in the area. Ethan's mind raced as he read those words. He felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted, as if the earth itself had opened up and swallowed him whole. Clara continued, detailing the circumstances of her departure. She had left, not because she didn't love Richard, but because she couldn't bear the shame of being pregnant out of wedlock. She had hidden her pregnancy from Richard, disappearing before he could ever know the truth. But now, with the passage of time, she felt it was time to reveal the secret she had kept for so many years. The child, she explained, was a boy, Ethan. Clara confessed that she had watched from afar as Ethan grew up, knowing that Richard had never known about him, never suspected that he had a son living just a few miles away. As Ethan read those words, his world seemed to crumble around him. His mind reeled with shock and disbelief. The father he had known, the father he had admired, had a secret one that he had never shared with Ethan or anyone else for that matter. The truth that Clara had held in her heart for so long was finally out in the open. Richard had a son, and Shadow, the horse that had always seemed so connected to Richard, had been the silent witness to it all. The letter went on to explain that Shadow had been more than just a horse to Richard. He had been a confidant, a keeper of secrets, and it was the horse who had been present at the final parting between Richard and Clara. Shadow had witnessed their last moments together, had known about the child that was never spoken of, and had carried that secret with him for all these years. Ethan had always thought that Shadow's attachment to his father's grave was rooted in grief, but now he realized it was something more. Shadow wasn't mourning Richard's death. He was guarding a secret that had remained hidden for decades. Ethan felt a sense of betrayal, confusion, and anger all at once. His father had kept this from him, had never once mentioned the existence of another son, another family. And yet, somehow, the horse had known. Shadow had known, and had kept the secret, just as his father had. As Ethan sat there, the letter still in his hands, he felt the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. His mind struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what he had just uncovered. A hidden family, a secret child, and Shadow, the horse that had always been by Richard's side, was the keeper of it all. But what did this mean for Ethan? What was he supposed to do with this newfound knowledge? Shadow, standing by his father's grave, seemed to wait for an answer, as if the horse knew that. Ethan's journey was far from over. The secret had been uncovered, but the true meaning behind it was still a mystery. And as Ethan looked at the horse, he knew that this was only the beginning. Ethan's hands trembled as he read the letter again, each word sinking deeper into his mind like a stone in water. The revelation that his father had kept such a monumental secret, one that changed the very fabric of his identity, was almost too much to bear. The letter had shattered everything Ethan had believed to be true about his family. Richard, his father, the man who had been a steady, unyielding presence in his life, had hidden a part of his past that Ethan could never have imagined. And now, he was left to grapple with the emotional fallout. The betrayal was the hardest part. Ethan had always looked up to his father, had admired his stoicism and strength, even though Richard had never been the type to show his emotions. There had always been a distance between them, an unspoken gap that Ethan had chalked up to the nature of their relationship. He had accepted that Richard's love had always been quiet, never displayed through grand gestures, but rather in the little things, the care he took in teaching Ethan about horses, the patience he showed when Ethan was learning to ride, the way he would always ensure the ranch was taken care of, no matter the cost. But now with the discovery of Clara and the secret child, Ethan was left questioning everything. Why had his father kept this from him? Why had he never mentioned Clara or the possibility of a half-brother? And most importantly, why had Shadow, the horse that seemed to know everything about his father, never shared this secret with him? As Ethan sat in his father's study, the room still thick with the smell of old leather and wood, he found himself lost in thought. He had always admired his father's ability to keep his emotions in check, but now it seemed that those emotions had been locked away in a way Ethan had never known. Richard had kept his pain and his regrets buried deep, even from his own son. And now, Ethan was left to navigate the murky waters of anger, confusion, and a deep sense of loss. It was as if his father had kept an entire part of his life hidden from him, a part that had now come to light in the most unexpected way. Ethan's thoughts turned to Clara, the woman who had written the letter. Who was she really? What had happened between her and Richard that had caused her to leave, to disappear from his life without a trace? And who was Jacob, the son that Clara had raised in secret? Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of a much larger story, one that he had never known, but that now seemed to be calling to him. The discovery of the letter had set off a chain of events that Ethan couldn't ignore. There was someone out there, a brother, someone who shared his blood, and Ethan was determined to find him. But where to start? And, more importantly, how would he confront this person when he found him? The questions weighed heavily on Ethan's mind as he set the letter down on the desk. He knew that he couldn't just sit idly by. He had to find Jacob. He had to learn the truth about his father's past, no matter how painful it might be. The letter had mentioned that Jacob was living on a nearby farm, a place that was just a few miles away from the ranch. It was a lead, a clue that Ethan could follow. But even as he made plans to seek out his half-brother, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to uncover more than just the truth about his father. He was about to step into a world he had never known, a world that might be even more complicated than he could have imagined. In the days that followed, Ethan threw himself into the search. He reached out to the few old friends of Clara that he could track down, hoping they might provide him with more information about Jacob. It wasn't easy. Clara had left the area long ago, and most people seemed reluctant to talk about her. But Ethan was persistent. He visited the local diner where the older generation still gathered to gossip and slowly pieced together snippets of information. There were vague references to a man named Jacob, someone who had grown up on a farm nearby, but nothing concrete. Each conversation felt like a dead end, but Ethan refused to give up. The more he learned, the more he realized that Jacob was out there somewhere, living a life that had been hidden from him for so long. And that life, Ethan knew, was intricately connected to his own. At the same time, Ethan continued to spend time with Shadow. The horse had become more than just a companion to him. Shadow had become a part of his emotional journey. As the days passed, Ethan found himself forming a deep connection with the horse, one that went beyond the bond of a trainer and his animal. He began to understand the depth of Shadow's attachment to Richard, the unspoken connection that had existed between them. It was more than just the love of a man for his horse. It was the shared understanding of pain, loss, and unspoken regret. Ethan could feel it now. Every time he stood beside the horse, the weight of the emotions Shadow carried. Shadow had been there for Richard through everything, the highs and the lows, the joys and the heartbreaks. And now it seemed Shadow was there for Ethan as well. In some strange way, the horse was helping Ethan work through his own feelings of betrayal and loss. Every time Ethan placed his hand on Shadow's neck, he could feel the silent comfort the animal offered, a comfort that seemed to transcend words. But there was more to it than that. The more time Ethan spent with Shadow, the more he realized that the horse had a role to play in all of this. Shadow wasn't just guarding the grave. Shadow was guarding the truth. The horse had been a witness to everything, a silent observer, to the moments that had shaped Richard's life, and by extension, Ethan's life. There were times when Ethan could almost feel Richard's presence in the horse's movements, as if the two were still connected in some way, even in death. And in that moment of realization, Ethan understood something deeper about his father. The pain, the regret, and the love that had been locked away for so long. Shadow had been the keeper of all of it. But as much as Ethan had come to rely on Shadow's silent companionship, he knew that the time had come to face the truth. The horse could only take him so far. To fully understand what had happened between Richard and Clara, and to learn about the brother he never knew he had, Ethan had to confront the past head-on. The discovery of the letter had opened a door, but now it was up to Ethan to walk through it, no matter how difficult the journey might be. The emotional weight of the situation pressed down on Ethan like a heavy burden. On one hand, he was angry at his father for keeping such a monumental secret from him. How could Richard have kept this hidden? How could he have left Ethan in the dark about something so important? But on the other hand, Ethan couldn't help but feel sympathy for his father. Richard had carried this secret alone for so long, and Ethan now realized that the emotional toll it had taken on him must have been immense. Richard's silence had been a form of self-preservation, a way of protecting himself from a past that had been too painful to face. Ethan's feelings were a jumble of anger, confusion, and sadness, but through it all, there was also a glimmer of hope. The truth was out there, and he was determined to find it. He would track down Jacob, he would uncover the full story, and he would finally come to terms with the father he had always known and the one he had never known. The journey was far from over. But for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt a sense of clarity. Shadow had helped him see that. Now, it was time to take the next step. The road ahead would be difficult, but Ethan knew that he couldn't walk it alone. The early morning mist clung to the ground as Ethan drove down the winding dirt road leading to Jacob's farm. The world around him was still and quiet, the only sounds the occasional crunch of gravel under the tires and the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. As the farm came into view, Ethan's heart began to race. He wasn't sure what to expect when he met Jacob, but one thing was certain. This meeting would be the culmination of everything he had been searching for. The truth hidden for so many years was finally within reach. The farmhouse was weathered but sturdy, nestled in a clearing surrounded by fields of tall, golden grass. In the distance, a few cows grazed lazily under the pale sky. The place looked peaceful, almost serene, but Ethan knew that beneath its calm exterior, the tension of years of hidden truths simmered. Jacob, the man who shared his blood, but whom he had never known, was somewhere on this property. Ethan parked his truck and approached the front door with slow, deliberate steps. His palms were clammy, his stomach a tangled knot. He had come this far, but the final step, meeting Jacob face to face, felt like a leap into the unknown. He had no idea how Jacob would react, or if he would even want to meet him at all. But there was no turning back now. The door opened with a creak, and a man stood in the doorway, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable. Jacob was rugged, with the kind of weathered appearance that came from a life spent working the land, broad-shouldered and strong, his hands calloused from years of labor. He was in his early 30s, but there was an age-old sadness in his eyes, something that spoke of years spent carrying a weight far heavier than his years would suggest. Jacob's gaze locked with Ethan's, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was thick with unspoken words, 1,000 questions hanging between them. Jacob's eyes were wary, cautious, as if sizing Ethan up. Ethan could feel the weight of that gaze, but he stood his ground, determined to face this moment head-on. "I'm Ethan," he said finally, his voice steady despite the chaos churning inside him. Jacob didn't respond immediately. Instead, he seemed to study Ethan as if trying to place him, or perhaps trying to reconcile the stranger standing before him with the brother he'd never known. After what felt like an eternity, Jacob stepped back from the doorway, giving Ethan a silent invitation to enter. "You're the one," Jacob said softly, his voice low, but filled with a strange mix of recognition and uncertainty. "You're Richard's son." The words landed like a weight in the room. Ethan nodded, feeling the gravity of the moment. "Yes," he said, his throat tight. "I didn't know about you or about her." He swallowed, trying to keep his emotions in check. "I never knew about Clara or the secret my father kept." Jacob's face softened for a brief moment, and he stepped aside, allowing Ethan to enter the farmhouse. Inside, the atmosphere was simple, with rustic furniture and the scent of wood and earth in the air. It was a place that felt lived in, worn by time, yet still full of life. "Clara," Jacob repeated, his voice tinged with a quiet bitterness. "She never told me anything about him, but I always knew, you know. I always knew that your father had another life before I came along." He paused, looking out the window as if gathering his thoughts. "But I didn't expect this. I didn't expect to meet you." Ethan took a deep breath, trying to steady the whirlwind of emotions threatening to overtake him. "I didn't expect this either," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I had no idea. None of this, the letter, the secret, it all came as a shock." They sat down at a small table in the corner of the room, the silence stretching between them. Before Jacob spoke again, his voice was more distant this time, as if he was speaking not just to Ethan, but to the past that still loomed over him. "I've known about you for a long time," Jacob said, his gaze fixed on his hands as they rested on the table. "Clara would tell me stories about Richard, about the way he was with Shadow, about how he'd talk to him like he was the only one who understood him. She'd always tell me that Richard loved me, but he could never give me what he gave you. I didn't understand it at first, but as I grew older, I began to see what she meant." He paused, looking up at Ethan, his eyes filled with a quiet sorrow. "She kept me away from him because she was afraid of what would happen if I found out the truth. She didn't want me to be rejected. She didn't want me to feel what she felt when she was cast aside. So she kept me hidden from Richard, from everyone." Ethan sat in stunned silence, absorbing Jacob's words. His mind raced as he processed the weight of what Jacob had just revealed. Clara's decision to protect him, to shield him from the pain of knowing the truth, had come at a cost. And now, here they were, two men bound, together by blood, yet separated by years of lies, by secrets too painful to bear. "I never wanted this," Jacob continued, his voice breaking slightly. "I didn't want to be the hidden son. I didn't want to be the secret. But Clara, she thought it was the only way to protect me. To protect both of us." Ethan's heart ached as he listened to Jacob. He had always assumed that Richard's silence was born out of some form of neglect, that he had simply chosen to ignore his other son, to leave him in the shadows of his past. But now, as Jacob spoke, Ethan began to understand. Richard had been a man torn between two worlds, too afraid to bring the truth into the light too, consumed by his own fears and regrets to reach out to the son he had never known. I never hated him for it, Jacob said, his voice raw. But I hated that I had to live in the dark. And I hated that Clara had to carry that burden alone. Ethan nodded, his throat tight. He understood now. He understood why his father had kept the secret, why he had kept Jacob away. It wasn't out of malice or indifference. It was fear. Fear of rejection. Fear of losing the life he had built with his family. And that fear had festered for years, leading Richard to make the choice to keep everything buried, to keep Jacob hidden in the shadows. The silence between them deepened, and Ethan felt a knot of tension in his chest. But then, slowly, he began to speak, his voice shaking with the rawness of the emotions he had been holding inside for so long. I've been angry at him, Ethan confessed. Angry that he kept this from me. Angry that I never knew about you, about Clara. But now, hearing what you've said, I think I understand. I think I understand why he did what he did. Jacob looked at Ethan, his expression softening. You're not the only one who was left in the dark, he said quietly. I've carried that weight for a long time. Ethan felt a wave of empathy for Jacob, a connection that went beyond their shared blood. In that moment, he realized that they were not so different after all. Both of them had lived with the weight of their father's secrets. Both of them had been forced to carry the burden of a past they had never fully understood. And then, as if the words had been waiting to be spoken, Ethan shared what he had learned from Shadow. I've been spending a lot of time with Shadow, Ethan began, his voice softer now, more reflective. And I think the horse knows more than we think. I think Shadow was the keeper of the secret. The days following their reunion passed slowly, but with each one, Ethan and Jacob grew more accustomed to the strange new reality they found themselves in. For years, they had lived in separate worlds, unaware of each other's existence. But now, as they spent more time together, they began to form an unspoken bond, a connection that was both fragile and strong, built on shared history and the understanding of their father's choices. It wasn't easy at first. The weight of the past still hung heavily between them, each of them, carrying their own baggage, their own hurts. But through the simple acts of daily life, working side by side on the farm, caring for the animals, and maintaining the land, they started to find healing. The ranch, once a place of solitude for both men, became a place where they could begin to mend what had been broken, where they could slowly build something new. As they worked together, they found themselves talking more about their father, about their memories, and about the ways Richard's love for both of them had shaped their lives, even if they hadn't known it. Jacob would tell stories of Richard's quiet moments, how he'd speak of Ethan and how proud he was of him, even if those words were always left unspoken. Ethan, in turn, shared his memories of the man he had once admired and loved, of the ways Richard's actions had always seemed to protect him, even in his silence. Shadow, too, seemed to understand the significance of the changes unfolding. The horse, once a silent witness to so much pain and confusion, had become an integral part of their healing process. Ethan and Jacob took turns riding Shadow, feeling the bond between them grow stronger with each passing day. The horse's calm presence, its unwavering loyalty, served as a reminder of the love that had once been shared and of the quiet reconciliation that was taking place between them all. One afternoon, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land, Ethan, Jacob, and Shadow found themselves at the edge of the ranch, standing side by side. The ranch that had once seemed so empty, so silent, now felt alive with possibility. The tension of the past was no longer present, replaced instead by the understanding that they had all suffered, but now, together they could move forward. Jacob glanced over at Ethan, his face softened with a quiet resolve. "You know," he said, his voice carrying a new weight, "we can make this work. We can run this place together. There's no reason why we can't honor what our father left behind and create something new." Ethan nodded, his heart light with the thought. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt hopeful. There were still so many unknowns in their future, so many things that could go wrong. But the truth was, they had each other now. They weren't alone anymore. They had a chance to rebuild, to create a new family out of the ashes of the old. "I agree," Ethan said quietly. "We can do this together." And as they stood there, looking out over the ranch they would now share, Shadow moved toward them. The horse, once a symbol of grief and loss, now seemed to represent something more, a new beginning, a new chapter. He walked slowly, his hooves making soft impressions in the earth, and as he passed Ethan and Jacob, he stopped for a moment, standing silently between them. Ethan reached out and placed a hand on Shadow's broad neck. Jacob did the same, their fingers brushing against the horse's coat. They stood like that for a few moments, allowing the peace of the moment to wash over them. They didn't need to say anything. The bond between them had been forged, and it was strong. Together, they were healing. It was then that they knew it was time. Time to let go of the past, time to move forward. Later that afternoon, they made their way to the small cemetery on the edge of the ranch where Richard was buried. The air was heavy with the scent of earth and grass, and the sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm, golden light over the grave. Shadow, as if guided by some quiet instinct, walked ahead of them, his movements slow and deliberate. He stopped at Richard's grave and stood there for a moment, his head bowed, as if paying his respects. Ethan and Jacob stood a few feet away, watching in silence. For a moment, everything was still. The past seemed to hover around them, but it no longer had the same weight. They had found understanding, and with it peace. Jacob stepped forward, his hand resting lightly on Shadow's mane. "I think he's ready," he said, quietly, his voice filled with a mixture of sadness and relief. "He's been carrying this burden for so long, but I think it's time for him to let go." Ethan nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "He's been the one constant in all of this," he said, his voice low. "He's the one who's always been here, even when we didn't know what we needed." They stood there together for a few moments more, the weight of the past slowly lifting. It was as if, by acknowledging their shared pain and letting go of the secrets, they were finally able to move forward, not just as brothers, but as a new family, bound not by the past, but by the future they would create together. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, Shadow took one last look at Richard's grave, and then, with a slow, deliberate step, he turned and walked away. Ethan and Jacob followed, their footsteps in sync, the sound of hooves and boots mingling in the quiet evening air. It was a new beginning. The final shot lingered on the three of them, Ethan, Jacob, and Shadow, walking together, side by side, into the fading light. They had found a way to heal, to reconcile, and to build something new. And as they walked away from the past, they knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together.